We are ready.
Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this second part of the sessions of today's lectures. I'm going to introduce our speaker in the second part, María Spoturno. María Laura is Associate Professor of Literary Translation and Literature of the United States at Facultad de Humanidades y Ciencias de la Educación at this university, Universidad Nacional de La Plata, and a researcher with the Consejo Nacional de Investigaciones Científicas y Técnicas here in Argentina. She is the principal investigator of the research project entitled Translation, Subjectivity and Gender, Ethical and Social Responsibility in Translation and Interpreting Practices. Her latest edited monograph is Subjetividad, Discurso y Traducción, la construcción del ethos en la escritura y la traducción, published by Ediciones Universidad de Valladolid. She has also co-edited 2 special issues of Mutatis Mutandis on transnational feminist translation studies and self-translation in Latin America. María Laura is the recipient of several research grants, including fellowships by the International Council of Canadian Studies, the German Academic Exchange Service, and the Fulbright Commission. So whenever you're ready, Laura, it's all yours.
Many thanks, Cecilia, for this introduction. Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to be part of these shared sessions. I wish to thank all the people behind the organization, the people at the Embassy of the United States in Argentina, and at our home at Universidad Nacional de La Plata. I wish to thank our colleague, Ana Principi, for helping us and guiding us through all the organization of these sessions. I also wish to thank the people who are following these sessions on YouTube, and say to start that my contribution today to these shared dialogues between the US and Argentina focuses on Latinx literatures, the construction of ethos, that is a construction of subjectivity, feminisms, and translation. So what I intend to do, just to give you an idea of my presentation, is to start by providing a quick, quite general overview of Latinx communities in the US. And I want to single out the contribution of Latinx literatures to the field of feminisms in general, but to feminisms of color in particular, trying to establish how feminisms of colors are read through translation, not only in the US, but also beyond the US, specifically in Latin America. To that end, I will focus on the figure of Chicana writer and activist, Gloria Saldua, and I plan to reflect on her work and legacy by looking at her, what I consider her major works: This Bridge Called My Back, the anthology This Bridge Called My Back, and Borderlands La Frontera. We will, at the end of the talk, of course, we will have some time for questions and answers. So, a few facts about the Latinx communities of the US. When speaking about the Latinx communities, we typically think of or refer to people who are based in the US and share some kind of Latin American origin. That might be from Mexico, Spanish, or from Mexican, Spanish, Caribbean, Central, and South American ancestries. I deliberately use the term Latinx here, as this is a gender-neutral term that may refer to anyone of Latin American descent. As we know, each denomination will bring about different discursive, ideological, cultural connotations. So according to the last census carried out in the USA, if I'm not wrong, in 2019, the Latinx population amounts now more or less, this is about 60,500,000 people. Our census in Argentina just happened, and this is about 47 million, just to give you an idea of our population as compared to the Latinx communities in the US. Now, the increasing relevance of the Latinx communities in the world of cultural literature and politics in the US and elsewhere is by now, I would say, undeniable. As far as the administration of Lyndon Johnson, there's been a week to celebrate the national Hispanic heritage. And now, and after Ronald Reagan's administration, this has been transformed into a month. Latinx literatures have definitely reinvigorated US American mainstream literatures in the late 20th century. And my talk today will try to show a little bit of this, of their relevance in the US and beyond. So, themes and methodologies of Latinx literatures. The relevance and diversity of Latinx literatures and more generally Latinx studies has been acknowledged by the proliferation of programs in the US and outside the US. I actually did my doctoral dissertation on a Chicana writer, who you may know, Sandra Cisneros. Different themes are at the core of Latinx literatures. And here we need to be very careful not to produce some kind of homogenization of the different authors and different communities within the Latinx communities in the US. So recurring themes and themes usually researched in our papers, dissertations, etc. Hybrid forms, the use of a borderlands, the creation and use of a borderlands discourse, translating identities, double consciousness, different areas cover this interest. These have been tackled from the point of view of history, immigration studies, cultural studies, gender studies, sexual dissident studies, spirituality, politics, and ideology. When it comes to the field of literatures, the problem of canons and literary canons and traditions is usually part of our lines of inquiries. That is how we place Latinx literatures and the production of Latinx literatures in the US. So very many different methodological perspectives have been outlined to address the corpus of Latinx literatures. So this traditionally has been done from the point of view of minority writing, and taking into consideration Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's work. There have been many social linguistic and discursive approaches, studies more focused on the literary, the fiction, the rhetorics of Latinx literatures. Post-colonial translation studies and gender studies have also have a say in this. Interlingualism and hybridization, which is one of the areas that has proven more fascinating to me, and of course, borders theory. Just to mention an example of the relevance of this in the field, a publication by Africa Vidal Flaramonte just came out, well, a year ago, and this is about traducción y literatura translingüe. Right? This was published by Iberoamericana. So, of course, in these studies, what we need to see is that, in general, these are quite transdisciplinary studies, which means, of course, that a paper focused on literary aspects will necessarily have to deal with some issues dealing with language contact phenomena, or the central peripheral questions, and so on. Translation, as I believe and will try to show, is always there as a very powerful instrument, and more than that, as we will try to see. In dealing with the problems and the specificity of Latinx, or trying to find certain specificities in the field of Latinx literatures, what we find is the notion, and I quote, of hyphenated Americans, right? Lives in the hyphen. This, of course, is a quite controversial issue that, has been discussed in the field of Latinx studies for quite some time, but is still of relevance. This is an exhibition that took place 2 years ago by Latinas Unidas en las Artes. And here what the artists tried to do was to explore the complexity of Latinx identity in the US today, trying to contest the idea of a uniform identity in favor of heterogeneity, plurality, collectivities, but also trying to find some sense of community among these differences. Community, they said, in the similarities between different Latinx cultures. In the field of Chicano and Latinx studies, the renowned scholar Ilan Stavans writes about the dilemmas of being a member of the Latinx community, and also about the dilemmas of the scholars trying to address the complexity of these communities and the artists and writers in the communities. So he poses the following questions. How can one understand the hyphen, the encounter between Anglos and Hispanics, the mix between George Washington and Simón Bolívar? Where can one begin exploring the Latino hybrid and its multiple links to Hispanic America? To what extent is the battle inside Latinos between two conflicting worldviews, one obsessed with immediate satisfaction and success, the other traumatized by a painful unresolved past evident in our art and letters? Should the opposition to the English-only movement, Chicano activism, Cuban exile politics, and the New Yorker existential manifestation of a collective, more or less homogeneous psyche? So Stavans, back in 2000, is advising us on the difficulties of finding a sense of community in difference, something artists are still trying to do. Even if there is no simple answer to these questions, I wish to approach and modestly contribute to this discussion by looking at identity from the perspective of translation. So, translation scholar Edwin Gensler, in a book in which he tackles the issue of translation in the Americas, says, translation is less something that happens between separate and distinct cultures and more something that is constitutive of those cultures. So what he's trying to prove is that translation is a primary means in the constructions of cultures and cultural identities, and should never be regarded as a mere instrument of communication across communities. Within Latinx literatures, translation becomes a strategy to remember, rehistoricize memory, and raise one's own identity. In a way, Alicia Parnoy's powerful, wonderful talk illustrated this quite well. You may be familiar with the work of Sandra Cisneros, Chicana author Sandra Cisneros, the author of The House on Mango Street and Caramelo or Puro Cuento. In her reflections about writing and about her role, her ethical role as a writer, she thinks of translation as intercultural mediation. And I quote, "We are amphibians and bridges to communities at war with each other. But it is our job in the new millennium to help bridge and translate. Otherwise, we all die." Or even before that, the two cultures, she says, are at great odds with each other. And perhaps my job is to be the translator for each community to see itself in a new light. It is a different kind of translation. Sandra Cisneros is thinking about translation within her own writing. Alicia was telling us, or was talking about the need to translate to survive, the need to translate to build networks of solidarity, to contribute to this discourse of solidarity she so wonderful defined in her doctoral dissertation back in 1997. So in the field of Latinx literatures, the time to write is many times the time to translate. Language is often a size of desire, of conflict, of possibility, but also of incapacity. To translate many times is to be across languages, to be across cultures, to be across text. Again, I'm quoting Alicia, we must think of text in a very wider sense. We're not just thinking about written materials, and this is why my presentation, for example, comes with a lot of artwork that may help us think of these issues from a different perspective as well. So a poetics of translation, a poetics of untranslatability sometimes. Here are a couple of examples from Sandra Cisneros' second narrative work, Women Hollering Creek, and Cristina Garcia's Dreaming in Cuban. But that's, how do you say it, water under the dam. I can't even get the sayings right, even though I was born in this country. We didn't say it like that in our house. Cristina Garcia's reflections in Dreaming in Cuban have a hint of melancholy there. Painting is its own language. Wanted to tell him translations, just confuse it, dilute it. Like words going from Spanish to English. I envy my mother, her Spanish courses sometimes. They make my English collapse in a heap. So, interlingualism, heterolingualism, translingualisms are categories that have been defined within linguistic literary translation studies to describe, to characterize the complexity of these narratives. I believe Julia Alvarez and Sandra Cisneros have definitely contributed to the recognition of Latinx literatures within and beyond, outside the US. And these are two authors. Of course, there are many others. You know, Diaz is another, Tato Laviera. Well, there are many others. But these two women writers have produced, have particularly reflected on these problems and on language as a site of contention, language as a site of desire, language as a site for translation. So, in Hande Garcia Groslo's their accents, and here the plural is very important to avoid thinking in unified identities, monolithic subjectivities. In a little antojo, you must tell us, Tia Carmen agrees. What's an antojo, Yolanda asks. She's back in the Dominican Republic. See, her answer right. After so many years away, she's losing her Spanish. And then Celaya Reyes, the narrator of Caramello, tells us after an incident at home where there's a problem on the ceiling, cielo raso in Spanish, and it goes, I scramble downstairs to tell everyone, only I don't have the words for what I want to say. Not in English, not in Spanish. There is, as I said, a constant metalinguistic reflection on these tensions and the possibility of encounter between two different linguistic systems, which are, of course, related to different values, right? Discursive, cultural, political, ideological, religious sometimes, and so on. So there is some sort of strategic linguistic and cultural mediation that I find fascinating as a subject for a study. But here is Julia Alvarez, and again, a quote from Hande Garcia Groslo's their accent. And here the illustration comes from a fragment in which a saying is in a way a saying in Spanish, or the literal translation of a saying in Spanish into English is surreptitiously introduced into the narrative discourse, and in a way is making readers see the other, right? See the difference in what they are reading. So they are reading in English, but the experience, it's a more diverse experience. It's not a monolingual novel. With patience will come, even a burro can climb a palm. This last was one of her many Dominican sayings she had imported into her scrambled English. She was talking about her mother. The saying in Spanish would be, con paciencia y calma, se subió un burro a una palma. The noun is not translated in the quote, right? So the works by Latinx authors such as Sandra Cisneros and Julia Alvarez often dramatize the various experiences of oppression suffered by Latinx women. And as such, they have been viewed through the lenses of gender and feminism and also translation. But this is not what we're going to do today. So multilingualism, translingualism is definitely at the heart of Latinx literatures. In that sense, translation within and across languages, across cultures and across texts will provide, I believe, a relevant angle to understand the complex nature of Latinx literatures, and also to start drawing connections between Latinx literatures and their contribution to the field of feminisms in general, but to the field of feminisms in Latin America in particular. So here we are interested in looking at translation and identity, translation as cultural strategic mediation within literary text, but also beyond literary text. Translation as solidarity, as Alicia was saying before. Translation across languages and cultures, translation and activism, translation and feminisms across the Americas. So this is why I have singled out, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, Gloria Saldua's work. Gloria Saldua was a Chicana poet, feminist, lesbian. She was born in 1942, and she died when she was only 61 years old. She suffered from a serious hormonal condition, and her health problems, as well as her experience as a migrant worker, are important when we approach her work, because her work, her writing, is organic. She had a direct experience of the borderlands, so it is no surprise that her book, Borderlands La Frontera, is so powerful. It is a testimonial, as Alicia was saying. So Gloria Saldua received a Bachelor of Arts and an MA of Arts in art from the University of Texas. She had a career as a primary school teacher and as a secondary school teacher, had to undergo a hysterectomy at the age of 38 because of her hormonal condition. She started menstruating when she was 3 months old. She was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. She died of complications from her diabetes, and she spent her life teaching, writing, fighting for human rights, for the rights of women, for the Chicana cause, etc. She got a PhD in literature 1 year after her death. At the time of her death, she was working on her doctoral dissertation, and she was awarded a PhD in literature posthumously. So it is hard to present Gloria Saldua's legacy. My approach has typically been from the perspective of translation studies and gender studies, translation, transnational feminism, and what we have called in the Mutatis Mutandis edition mentioned before, transnational feminist translation studies. So I will briefly talk about the anthology Gloria Saldua co-edited with Sherry Moraga called This Bridge Called My Back, Writings by Radical Women of Color, and to her only single author monograph, Borderlands, La Frontera. So what is the relevance of her work? Her work, Gloria Saldua's work, has had a tremendous impact on Chicano studies, border theory, political science, spiritual studies, literary studies, translation studies, critical pedagogies, feminism, ethics studies, and Meg Ergun has written about that, gender studies, queer studies. There are tons of dissertations, special issues honoring her work, monographs, readers to help us read her work. There is a society for the study of Gloria Saldua that was founded at the University of Texas just 1 year after her death. There is a foundation against linguistic terrorism, which is a concept she defines and develops in La Frontera, which is to do with the mission of this foundation would be to end or at least prevent the attacks on people's native languages by dominant cultures or sectors. This, as I said, is defined in her book. The Gloria and Evangelina Saldua's papers are located at the University of Texas. So, key notions that would have huge impacts on various activism, theories, pedagogies, and so on, both in Western, so-called Western and non-Western regions of the world, are the way in which it tackles the problem of identity, the notion of borderlands, this genre she defined, and which La Frontera is an example, autohistoria, teoría, feminisms, and the notion of bridge. You might remember that in the anthology that Alicia showed us, You Come Round the Fire, the notion of bridge is also a very powerful metaphor to symbolize the solidarity networks between women, between activists, militantes, and translators who are offering their job. She said, we have no money to pay for the translators, but they are doing pro bono translations in order to build a solidarity network. Well, these two anthologies happened in the 80s in the United States. And even if perhaps they didn't know about each other, there are lots of connections that can be established between This Bridge Called My Back, Esta Puente Mi Espalda, the Spanish translation, also produced in the United States, and You Come Round the Fire by Alicia Barnoi. So this is an iconic anthology in the field of feminisms, right? Not just in the US, but outside the US. This is this book works on the notion of a dynamic open anthology, which means that not all anthologies are the same. Look at the last one, the latest version of this anthology was just published last year by SUNY Press. So with each release of the anthology, there is some sort of renewal of the text within the anthology, but also of the paratext. The impact and relevance of both the first and more than anything, the first and second edition of the anthology were quite innovative for the time, and also the translation can be seen in Latin America through the voice of different feminist scholars. For example, Ochi Curiel, and this is a very quick translation, says that the voices of the women of color in this bridge denounce the racism in North American societies, aside from that expressed within feminism, and the sexisms of the political and ethnic movements they were part of. That is, feminists of colors in the US, Latinx women, Chicanx women in particular, were part of what has been called, well, Chicano activist movements that were quite misogynist at times. So there is this, there is a much more complex system of oppression at stake. And this is part of the contribution of this anthology. It will help us define the notion of intersectionality, even if we know, yes, there are traces of this notion, even if not formalized as a program in the previous century in Latin America and elsewhere. So Marisa Belaustigoitiaga-Rius from Universidad Autónoma de Mexico says that the ontology has been key to the intersectional turn in counter-hegemonic feminisms in the US and other regions of the world. Actually, and as I will later discuss or present, very briefly actually present, Marisa Belaustigoitiaga is trying to, through the translation of Borderlands La Frontera that is published in Mexico, she's trying to connect the experiences of indigenous women, the indigenous women in the US and indigenous women in Mexico. So Jackie Alexander, Ana Louise Keating, perhaps the most important Ansalduan scholar based in the US, say that the ontology has been fundamental to think and rethink feminisms from plural and situated perspectives. The translation into Spanish produced in the US a few years after the initial publication of the anthology, but after the second edition, is an offering to the Hermanas Latinoamericanas, to the Latin American sisters, and becomes a relevant contribution to think about critical decolonial feminisms in Latin America. This is a text that is usually included in seminars and grad courses on feminisms in Argentina, right? There are many metaphors and concepts, but perhaps I would like to deal just with two of them, right? The notion of bridge, and here this comes from a dictionary that was published by Flaxo last year, a dictionary in which different concepts from that are relevant to discuss Latin American fiction and cultural products includes an entry in which the notion of borderlands, and this is the entry in Spanish, is called Borderlands, is discussed. They also suggest that spatial metaphors as organizers of feminist discourse and experience gain momentum, right, within activisms in the US during the 80s. And of course, I mentioned this anthology. The notion of borderlands, which is immediately associated to the work and legacy of Gloria Saldua, might be defined, as I tried back into 2020, as the liminal transgressive territory, which is not restricted to a geopolitical area, but rather defined by psychological, sexual, spiritual, and often, quite often, painful experiences. The new mestiza consciousness is the consciousness of the borderlands. Maria Lugones will say in her theory of decolonial, in proposing a theory of decolonial feminism, she will assert, I am proposing a feminist border thinking, where the liminality of the borders is a ground, a space, a borderlands, to use Gloria Saldua's terms, not just a split, not an infinite repetition of dichotomous hierarchies among these soul specters of the human. So the notion of bridge is interesting. It's relevant to mention that in all the editions of this anthology, we have the same introductory poem, and this is a poem called The Bridge, which was written by poet Kate Rushin, and this was commissioned for the first edition of the anthology. Everything that I'm saying about this anthology, I have discussed with my dear colleague at Universidad Nacional de La Plata, Gabriel Matelo, and there is an article that is forthcoming, well, I suppose later this year, right? So, and Saldua's work actually anticipates the basis, in a way, of a transnational perspective in feminist studies, but also in translation, feminist translation studies. Gloria and Saldua will argue for the non-mediated presence of new voices in a space which had been governed so far by the paradigm of hegemonic or white feminisms. So she was struggling for the direct visibility of women of color, Asian, Indian, Latinx, Black women. Basically, this means that everyone has the right to speak. Everyone must be heard. Everyone must speak for himself. No salvationist rhetoric, as Argentine Karina Vidaseca would put it, applies here. It's not the problem of some women coming to save women that are placed in unprivileged situations. Gloria Saldua would claim, and she was an example, her life was an example of this, of a person that had suffered enormously and was struggling to have other women to promote a non-mediated discourse. Translation becomes an important, Gloria Saldua and Sherry Moraga, the editors of the first editions of the anthology, are very aware of the power of translation. And of course, intersectionality is a governing principle in the selection, in the selection of the text composing the anthology. Whenever I speak about this anthology, I use this quote because I think it's brilliant. This is a letter that is called Speaking in Tongues, letters to third world writers to be. This is a letter that is addressed to women who wish to be writers. Gloria Saldua, in this very short extract that you might read and you may be reading right now, we do have the translation into Spanish as well. She has defined canonical views on feminism. She's establishing a productive, controversial connection with Virginia Woolf's essay, A Room of One Sound. So she says, forget the room of one sound. While in the kitchen, lock yourself up in the bathroom, right on the bus, the welfare line, on the job, or during meals, between sleeping and walking. I write while sitting on the job. So it's demystifying the act of writing, right? No long stretches in the typewriter unless you're wealthy or have a patron. You may not even own a typewriter. While you wash the floor or clothes, listen to the words chanting in your body. Writing is organic. When you are depressed, angry, hurt, when compassion and love possess you, when you cannot help but write. This is like Kafka talking about the impossibility of not writing. So in this way, she addresses so-called, this is a term that they use to define their identity, right, in this anthology, radical women of colors, but also third women writers. This is an organic urge to write. Gloria Saldua, well, there are many interviews we can read where we hear different, we listen to, or we read and imagine that we are listening to Gloria Saldua speak about her ideas and her work, but not just in her literary or in her drawings, in literary production, or even in her drawings, because she was also an artist, and many drawings are kept in the Gloria Saldua's literary trust. So in this interview with Anne Royman, Gloria Saldua expresses, well, in a way, she sort of felt upset because the notion of intersectionality, which is of course coined by Kimberly Crenshaw also in the 80s, is definitely present and powerfully present in this anthology. So she says, I think one of the first things that Sherry and I and other women of color who were writing in this word called My Back were activists in the early 80s, late 70s, it's about the intersection of things. It's about the intersection of race and gender. Sexism is not the only kind of oppression that women suffer. Race has to do with it, class has to do with it, sexual orientation has to do with it, age has to do with it, abilities, and so on. There is a note, again, to the anthology edited by Alicia Bernot, You Can't Run the Fire. In this anthology, there is a reflection by one of the, in the introduction, there is a reflection by one of the contributors. There's a quote of one, or of a conversation or something. And there is this idea that each experience, even if there were some points in common between their experiences as illegal prisoners, as disappeared people, there is also the specificity of each of the experiences, which is of utmost importance when we think about their testimony, right? Our testimony to, for example, recover identity. So many things in common between, I believe, between these two works. So, as I said, even if not fully formalized, there is the seeds to the transnational feminist perspective, definitely a transnational feminist perspective within this work. So, in general, and just to mention a few, well, some of its characteristics, we know that there is a denaturalization of gender patterns and stereotypes. Together with that, there will be a celebration of diverse intersubjectivities and complex discursive formations that can account for this diversity. There is the notions, the principles of intersectionality, and a different concept, interconnectivity, that Gloria and Saldua was starting to produce between 2002. There's an essay where she aims at a poetics of interconnectivity that is, of course, related to intersubjectivity. There's dialogue, there's tension, there's negotiation, and hopefully there's also an encounter between different people, across multiple borders. Translation is no doubt essential to enable, or to enable, let's say, just to enable these dialogues. Strategic, academic, and literary networks, such as the one we're having here today, become also very important. And as has been mentioned before, there is this idea of challenging north, south, west, east vectors, which means that knowledge produced in the so-called global north will perhaps be useful, we don't know, to understand what happens in the so-called global south, but perhaps it will be more interesting to look at what scholars, activists, researchers, professors have to say from a situated perspective. Of course, in dialogue with other researchers and studies. So there is the recognition of the need and relevance of translation. We have based our study of this anthology in the second edition, because this is the one that was used as the source text, let's say, for the anthology in Spanish. Just to give you an idea, if you don't know the anthology, this edition has 6 thematic sections, 46 texts in total, and the genres, the text types are interesting here, because we are not going to be faced with stories or just stories, but there will be letters, essays, poems, interviews, more academic writing, a more poetic style, and everything counts as a theoretical reflection on the problems, on the issues discussed in the anthology. Paratext and illustration also add to this. This is the article I was mentioning before. So the anthology is translated into Spanish by Ana Castillo and Norma Alarcón, also contributors to the anthology, and established in 1988 by Eason Press. Kitchen Table, the publishing house, was a very important feminist initiative in the 80s in the United States. So there's also this later, we couldn't call it an addition, but this is how the text is available in Argentina, in Latin America, if we would like to get it, right? So this is produced by the Suda Queer collective, and it is printed on demand. And as you may see, they have changed the cover. So it's quite different from the artwork in the original or in the translation. And in a way, even if the texts remain intact, I mean, as compared to those in the Spanish translation, there is a reinscription of meaning, as Lawrence Venuti would put it, because the text is now circulating within copyleft rules and in different contexts altogether. It's quite an interesting thing that we found as we were doing our research, Gabriela Matelo and I. So the path from this bridge to Esta Puente, a few things to say or highlight. Editing strategies are radical. They can be said to be transformative. There is a political and enunciative stance that is made explicit in the paratext, but also in the text, where we will find different translators' notes, and the anthology in Spanish is also accompanied by a glossary. And as those of you who are translators know, when we add a glossary to our translations, we are producing, or we are trying at least to produce some sort of mechanism to control how the text will be understood, if one could, right? But it's a strategy that might be seen, and also in a way is restricting the meaning of terms, right? The polysemy, the polyphonic character of the book. So one thing that we noticed right from the start is that the titles are quite different. The spread called My Back, Esta Puente, Mi Espalda. Those of you who are Spanish speakers know that the more typical form for puente is the masculine form. But these radical translators are using an old form of Spanish, and so they are modifying the noun puente as a feminine noun. The anthology in English speaks about writings by radical women of colors, where the translation into Spanish will speak about voices, voces de mujeres tercermundistas. So there is a political, ideological difference, and then the relocation en los Estados Unidos, which perhaps was not necessary in the case of the anthology in English. But here, if we are reading the text in Spanish, we know that this is about so-called third world women in the US, right? Now, the translation praxis is also transformational, it's critical, is situated, and is affiliated with the tradition of La Malinche, deliberately. What we find is transgressive linguistic and textual forms, denaturalization of gender patterns and stereotypes, as we saw, for example, in the feminine use of the noun puente in Spanish. There is the celebration of collective subjectivities, a team of editors and translators working together, and this becomes evident as we study the text, the paratext, and also the translation of specific text. There is a sense of an ethos or discursive image that is collective, that is celebrating the community, but also ruled by the principle of intersectionality. And there is this idea of transcending the limits of the problems in the US and offering to, trying to contribute to the dialogue between women feminists in the US, feminists of color in the US, and feminists and women in general in other parts of Latin America. Of course, because this is a situated translation, this is an example of a situated translation practice. The translators recognized in their introductory notes that there are limitations to their job and that they cannot possibly reproduce the complexity, the discursive complexity of the different texts, which represent a variety of Englishes in the original. These are productive collaboration, strategic alliances, solidarity networks, because they did all this without a lot of money, as Alicia was saying. The anthologies are meant to challenge hierarchies of the patriarchal system, establish horizontal dialogues, introduce new voices, voices that perhaps Ana Castillo, Sherry Moraga, of course, Gloria Saldua were already very well known at the time they published the first anthology, but there are other authors that were not. So the anthology is gradually giving, because as I said, this the notion of an open, dynamic anthology is giving the opportunity to new writers, new authors, and also incorporating genres that have not been typically minor genres many times, like letters, memoirs, etc., considered, I mean, minor genres, but they are validating them within the publication in this anthology. Esta Puente definitely helps build a bridge across women reaching out to Latin America. And as I said before, the translation is made available in Buenos Aires, in La Plata, through this radical collective editorial project. So the second contribution of Gloria Saldua that I would like to present is her only single author book, Borderlands, La Frontera. There is a fourth edition, a fifth edition of this book that just came out in March 2022. So in this case, all of the editions have been published by Untitled Press, and we can say that Ana Saldua's work is kept intact in all these editions. I haven't checked the one that has been just published, but what changes are the paratextual narratives that are produced by critics. Sometimes interviews are included. There's also the testimony of artists. I think in the fourth edition, that was the 25th anniversary edition, and with their work or words, they will introduce or comment the text. In this case, I'm sure many of you have read Borderlands, La Frontera, the new Mestiza. There are two sections. One of the difficulties with this book is that it's not easy to classify it as a memoir, an essay, particularly the first section, a prose poetry. It's everything at once. It's a corrido, a memoir, testimony, etc. Section 2 is easier in that sense because it's a collection of poems, some of which have been self-translated. In general, when we read about La Frontera, it is section 1 that is addressed in our scholarly work. The poems have not been studied not that much. As I was saying before, autohistoria teoría could be the genre, the text type that may classify, that may help us classify this text. In Ana Saldua's words, autohistoria teoría, and I quote, is a genre of writing about one's personal and collective history using fictive elements, a sort of fictionalized autobiography or memoir. An autohistoria teoría is a personal essay that theorizes. So that is definitely one of the contributions of La Frontera, because it's a wonderful example of that. The new mestiza consciousness that dwells in borderlands, and the polyphonic border discourse that is built in the text. So as much as in the case of Sandra Cisneros' Caramelo, for example, A Woman Coloring Creek, we see here a discourse that is infused by at least, and as she says in the same book, 8 different language varieties. There are today, I was going to say only, right, because it took quite a long time to be produced in Spanish. There are 2 published translations, complete translations of this book into Spanish that happen simultaneously, and a 3rd translation that I have recently heard of that is forthcoming in Argentina. So this is a collective translation. I'm really looking forward to it, but I don't, unfortunately, I was not given access to this material, so there was no way I could add it there. There are, of course, different partial translations into Spanish and other languages of individual chapters. Chapter 5, How to Tame a Wild Tongue, has been published by translated by Liliana Valenzuela, a star translator within the Latinx communities of the US, and also by Argentinian scholar Paola Formiga, and published in the journal Catatai 10 years ago. There are partial translations into Spanish. And the first one, chapter 2, is interesting because it was included in Bell Hook's another anthology, Otras Inapropiables, right? So this is a translation that has been read a lot in Spanish. So these are the 2 published, complete published translations of Anne Saldua's work. One was published in Mexico by UNAM. It was the Programa de Género that commissioned this translation. And as you may know, Norma Cantú is a quite well-known Chicana writer, activist, and scholar, and also a translator herself. And the other was published in Madrid by Capitan Swing, and this is the individual work of Carmen Valle Simón. So these 2 happened simultaneously. It took almost 30 years for this book to be fully translated, but then we hear that there were at least 3 or 4 projects, because there was also a project at Universidad Nacional de Quilmes in Argentina, but that didn't come. They couldn't. They didn't manage to continue with the translation workshops and finish the work. So, as I was saying, it took almost 30 years we had to wait, let's say, 30 years to see these books published in Spanish. Spanish is a symbolical language, right? Spanish pervades Latinx writers. Spanish translation into Spanish becomes a form of writing, a form of survival within Anne Saldua's work. And so linguistically, culturally, symbolically, it was significant that this book was translated into Spanish. Of course, there is the question of access. Not many people Spanish-speaking people can read the book unless it is translated, of course. So the study of the Spanish translations, it's interesting to see how the texts are received and resignified, transformed in different non-English speaking discursivities and formations. As I may have mentioned a minute ago, the translation project that is carried out in Mexico is commissioned by the Programa de Género at UNAM. Universidad Autónoma de Mexico. And the person that commissions the translator is the feminist scholar Marisa Belautigoitiaga Ruiz, who also adds a very lengthy and very quite interesting introduction to the translation. Norma Cantú is the leading translator and is recognized as the translator of Borderlands La Frontera, but it takes very little time to understand that it has been, that this is a product of collective work. It is acknowledged in the different introductory notes that poet and activist Shana Caraza produced a draft of 3 chapters, and that, well, she's quite a renowned Chicana scholar, Claire Joyce Smith, translated the poetry section, the whole, I mean, all the poetry section. Of course, this was later subject to Norma Cantú's revision. In the case of the translation published in Spain, in Madrid, this is individual work. There is an introduction, a very short introduction, in which Carmen Bashi tells us about the principles governing her translation. We will see a bit of that later on. So the lines of analysis that I have followed, there are 2 articles that I published on this, one in Venezuela, in a journal, in a linguistics journal in Venezuela, and the other in the Routledge Handbook of Translation, Feminism and Gender, edited by Luis Fonflauto and Calacamal. So I tried to analyze this text, taking into consideration not only the text, but also the context of production and circulation, the meta text, the reception, the paratext of the translators, the paratext, the editors, linguistic, cultural, institutions, settings, reinscriptions, how meaning is transformed across these various settings. I was also interested in looking at the presence of the translators in the text. How visible is their experience as translators in the text? In other words, I was also trying to see, to examine the translator's ethos, and also the way in which translators have reconfigured, reshaped feminist ethos and border discourse in the translation, because these are the challenges, right, of translating this text. Gender issues, of course, were also part of my my line of inquiry. In the case of the paratextual enunciation, both translators agree that it has been a big challenge to translate, to read and translate this text. For Norma Cantú, Gloria Saldua was a comadre. So she felt in many cases, and we can see that in the translation itself, attached to what she was translating, and also as a Chicana to what she was saying. So there is, particularly in Norma Cantú's translation, a clear political position before the translation that is being done. There is some commentary on the process of the translation as we read the translation, which is, I believe, well, fascinating. So there's writing and translating, the difficulties of writing and translating such a complex text. There is an explanation of the translation strategies and techniques used in the translation, and also there is a reflection regarding the model reader and the targeted audience. Who are they translating for? Are they translating for scholars? Are they translating within an institutional setting? One of the translation was commissioned by a university program at a Mexican university. The other is part of the catalog of a more general editorial project. And so there are reflections on about all this in the paratext, the translators write. And there are different reading paths. And talking about that, I believe it's relevant to remember how Gloria Saldua presents her work to the reader. This is a fragment from the preface to the first edition of Borderlands, which is reproduced in most, I would say in all of, but in most, at least in most of the different editions. So she says, the switching of codes in this book from English to Castilian Spanish to the North Mexican dialect to Tex-Mex to a sprinkling of Nahuatl to a mixture of all of this reflects my language, a new language, the language of the borderlands. They are at the juncture of cultures, languages cross-pollinate and are revitalized. They die and are born. Presently, this infant language, this bastard language, Chicano Spanish, is not approved by any society. By we Chicanos no longer feel that we need to beg entrance, that we need always to make the first adventure to translate to Anglos, Mexicans and Latinos, apology blurting out of our mouth with every step. Today, we ask to be met halfway. This book is our invitation to you from the new mestizas. So there is this political, challenging overture, an openly interlingual praxis, a transgressive use of languages that will define a polemic authorial ethos right from the start. I believe that this is not that this introduction does not reflect just the challenge of the status quo, but also in a way some sort of conciliation. We ask to be met halfway, right? This book is an invitation to your reader, but we need to meet halfway. In the case of the translations published in Mexico, one of the problems in dealing with gender issues was grammatical gender, because as Marisa Velázquez-Goitia and Norma Cantú acknowledge, this is something we cannot get rid of so easily in Spanish. So Norma Cantú says, en algunos casos ha sido posible bifurcar los géneros en la versión traducida, falta un acento, es decir, incluir tanto lo femenino como lo masculino. Sin embargo, en muchas ocasiones, con el objeto de prestar fluidez a la lectura, se ha elegido ya sea uno u otro género, confiando en que quienes se acerquen a este texto formen su propio criterio en cuanto al uso de construcciones inherentemente sexistas y entiendan que las traductoras, look at the plural, las traductoras rechazan tales estrategias. So I will just read a fragment in English translation. In some cases, it's been possible to bifurcate, I'm trying to keep the verb used there, the genders in the translated version, which we know will account for some sort of binarism. That Norma Cantú, 2 years after this is published, will say, okay, today I would use some other symbol to address gender-marked nouns, right? So she was trying to include the feminine as much as the masculine. Now, she is, of course, aware of the limitations imposed by the system of Spanish, but they trust, as they say, that readers will not judge them and will not attribute any sexist constructions in the translation to them as individuals. So we should say that the experience of translating a fragment from this book and observing gender marks, nouns, and language in general is quite hard. In the case of the translation produced in Spain, there is also a reflection upon gender issues. En primer lugar, la tarea de traducción se ha guiado por una voluntad humildemente despatriarcalizadora. El español es una lengua obsesiva en cuanto al uso del masculino gramatical como genérico. En las partes en que Gloria Saldua se expresa en español, utiliza a veces masculinos genéricos y los he respetado. I just showed you an example in the fragment from the introduction I read, where the word chicanos appears as a generic form. ¿Quién puede ser la nueva mestiza de esta edición? Podría ser cualquier ser humano, mujer, hombre o cualquier otra etiqueta con la que se identifique, a quien el uniforme del género del patriarcado le quede estrecho, le apriete, le ahoguen o se le estalle por las costuras. So, the target reader in this edition is perhaps intended, as Carmen Valle says, for each and every human being who finds the patriarchal, she says, uniform of gender too tight or suffocating. So the Spanish version, we should say, explicitly addresses a general audience, right? So for Valle, it is not, for Carmen Valle, it's not necessary to produce certain adjustments in terms of the discursive complexity and, for instance, code switching, because she trusts readers that are interested in this book will also have some general knowledge about the either because they are university students or because of their own personal interest, but she trusts people reading her translation will have a knowledge or some familiarity with interlingualism, something that is not so obvious in the other translation. So when it comes to political and cultural awareness, we must say that Norma Cantu's shows in her translation, we see a stronger and more committed position. She is a member of the same community, so this is something she needs to do in her translation. This is offered as a mestiza translation, consciousness, some kind of collective insider's perspective. In the case of Carmen Valle, and even if this will not come as a surprise, this political commitment is relative, even if the translation, I would say, it's quite a good one, right? From the point of view of interlingualism, translingualism, and so on. Here we have the insight of one individual translator and a more distant perspective. I just want to show a few examples of what the translation looks like, right? One of the concepts that is relevant in this book is the concept of homeland, right? And what to do with that in the translation. So Norma Cantu has chosen, and she reflects upon it, to say homeland, that is to stick to the term in English, but she adds the noun in a position, nuestra tierra, as a way to explain what is happening there. In the case of Carmen Valle, she uses the term patria, which is a term some feminists would not use. They would rather favor the use of the term in some sectors of the terms matria. As you know, etymologically speaking, the term comes from Latin and means pertaining to the father. So this is not perhaps a wise choice for this particular translation. Other things that happen in this brief fragment is for some of us, and what to do, because for some of us, it's wonderful in English, nothing happens with gender in this us. It could be anyone, but in Spanish, we can't do the same thing. So Norma Cantu takes a step further and says, para algunas de nosotras. So this is about women. Carmen Valle will opt for the masculine generic form and will say para algunos de nosotros. And then the fragment continues. So in terms of translation strategies and techniques, we find that both translators, or the team of translators working in Mexico and Valle's individual translation, they will use similar strategies at in different passages of the translation. In some cases, they will decide not to translate or to offer what they call counter translations. They will, in some fragments, we will see that they try to reproduce or recreate interlingualism. So code switching is an operation in this translation. They produce some neologism. For instance, Norma Cantú, this is something Norma Cantú does, when she has to define, I think that in the original we have Chicanos, and she wants to use a more general term. And what she says, because she's speaking or she is choosing to define the noun as a feminine, she says Latina estadounidenses instead of Latino estadounidenses. That would be the rule in Spanish. Or she would opt to use the plural of gays, that is transgressive from the point of view of grammatical linguistic norms in Spanish. So there are interventions in both translations, but I wouldn't say that they can be called systematic. So here we have an example I love in this book. This is from How to Tame a Wild Tongue. And here we have the juxtaposition of languages in the original. En boca cerrada no entran moscas. The literal translation and the inverted commas provide a translation, possibly a quote. Flies don't enter a closed mouth is a saying I kept hearing when I was a child. This is a saying is presenting this knowledge, this cultural knowledge that is in a way included in the saying. It's not actually, perhaps it could be called a proverb, but this cultural knowledge is presented as such to the reader. So Saldua is not just saying en boca cerrada no entran moscas, which would leave many readers without understanding what was going on in the text. She's producing a literal translation. And on top of that, she's saying, reader, this is a saying. You have to interpret it as part of my cultural heritage. So this is why I believe there is this idea of fostering dialogues, right? Ser habladora was to be a gossip and a liar, to talk too much. Well, we know about the differences between the words liar and mentiroso, mentirosa in Spanish. They don't bear the same connotations. So here it is surprising what the team working in Mexico does. So there is a rationalization of the syntax, and it goes, de niña escuchaba mucho el dicho, en boca cerrada no entran moscas. So there is no interlingualism, and this reframing of the sentence is potentially producing a different reading experience. In the text in English, what we hear first is the saying that the I kept hearing as a child, right? So it's a different experience altogether. Carmen Valle produces a different text. En boca cerrada no entran moscas. Flies don't enter closed mouth. So she has decided to stick to the encounter, to produce this dialogue between languages in her writing. I don't know if there is a question. Okay, good. This is something for me to keep track of the time. Yes, I will be finishing in a few minutes. Thank you. So, so the interaction between languages is kept in Vache's translation, which I think preserves multilingualism quite well. And this is something that was really, really hard to do in the translations. So in terms of discourse, and as I was saying, Cantú's version evidences a more homogeneous discourse with techniques that will affect the graphic, rhetorical, and literary aspects of the text. Valle is more daring, and she will produce a more heterogeneous, polyphonic, poetic discourse. So we have to bear in mind that Cantú's translation is produced with an academic reader in mind, and possibly a student. grad students in feminist studies, cultural studies, etc. So there's a lot that is studied there for their benefit. Well, this was just to show that typographies were kept in the translation done by Bashir, but most in the translation produced in Mexico. The other thing that I would like to show to end my presentation is to do with the presence of the translators in the text. Norma Cantu will present herself as working at times working in a team, but her individual presence will also come to the fore. There's an academic, speculative, but also intimate tone in the translator's notes that she adds to her work. Her visibility is really huge in the translator. Something different happens in Bashir's translation. I think that there are only 3 translator's notes, and the introduction that she writes is quite brief. This is the more poetic literary side. There's little visibility of the translation, and as I said before, this is the result of an individual translation project. So I mean, when we say that the translator has more visibility, what do we mean? Have a look at these quotes. Well, this is a section in a passage in La Frontera in Borderlands, where we are told about the abnormal bleeding, the early period that Gloria Saldua had. So she says she felt shame for being abnormal, so bleeding distanced her from others. Sentía vergüenza por ser anormal, el sangrado la distanció de los demás. Well, this is a translation with my comment on individual choices, but the note by the translator says, Gloria comenzó a menstruar tempranamente debido a un desequilibrio hormonal. So we know that translators many times have notes that may help readers complete the idea of, I don't know, to have more information about the author. Readers may not know that Gloria Saldua had this hormonal condition, particular hormonal condition, right? But she's saying Gloria, not Saldua. This is intimate. This is showing some intimacy. We know that they knew each other. We know the admiration Norma Cantu had for Gloria and Saldua as a person, as a human being, as an activist, and as a writer. But this will change. The tone will change when they are talking. When the text is about other things, right, that have to do with cultural aspects, issues, etc. There are tons of examples of this. I just selected one. At Pan American University, I and all Chicano students were required to take 2 speech classes. Their purpose, to get rid of our accents. En la Pan American University nos exigían a todos los chicanos llevar 2 clases de speech. Su meta, borrarnos el acento. So there are 2 different notes for such a short passage. And Saldua, so here there's no name we're not working on a first name basis. So this becomes the author again. So she's also telling us or giving us information about her life. She studied in Edinburgh, Texas, en la Pan American University, hoy día University of Texas, right? Las clases de speech pretendían enseñar pronunciación. And here we've got the judgment of the translator. They were allegedly intended to teach pronunciation, diction, and articulation, phonology in general, etc. So in many translators' notes, Norma Cantu is going to give her own opinions, not only as a member of the Chicana community, but also as a Chicana scholar. So in some cases, she will distance herself from whatever it is she's translating and saying, okay, at the time of Gloria Saldua, this is the knowledge she had, this is the knowledge that was available, but today we will think of this issue from a different perspective. And that happens a lot. So some future directions. So what I have tried to do in these talks is to, at the beginning, is to give a very brief overview the complexity of Latinx literatures and Latinx communities of the US and beyond the US. I have tried to focus on Gloria Saldua's legacy because I think this is an impressive legacy and a relevant legacy to think and rethink feminisms through translation in different regions of the world. Of course, I'm based in Argentina, and this is where I'm doing the revision of my condition as a woman scholar. So I believe that without translation, these struggles and these solidarity networks are not possible. More work needs to be done on transnational feminist translation within and beyond, of course, Latinx literatures. The example of Esta puente mi espalda might be interesting to start other initiatives. There is a problem of subjectivity in translation, subjectivity within books that are, or narratives that are written as if they were translations, right? We are talking many times about translating identities, the problem of revisiting the problem of the hyphen, as Meg has also written from a feminist perspective on the ethics of translating. Feminist networks need to be built. Collective practices of translation seem to prove more effective when we are trying to fight for common causes. Furthering dialogues, as we are trying to do today through this shared sessions, I think constitute another great idea. So there is a time for questions and answers. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Maria Laura. Great presentation, as usual. So maybe we can ask some questions while the questions from YouTube are coming.
Sure. Shall I stop sharing the one? Just in case someone wants to go back. Yeah.
Maria Laura, so you spoke about working with Saldua's work while you were doing your dissertation, when you were working on, not dissertation, but when you are working in English with her work in Argentina. So it only arrived last year in Spanish to Argentina in 2021. Is that right? Because there is no access to the Mexican edition in Argentina of this book.
You mean Borderlands, Alicia?
I'm sorry, Borderlands, yes.
The translation of Borderlands was published, well, the translations were published in 2015 and 2016, and you can access them.
No, I'm talking about Esta puente. Esta puente in 2021. Esta puente took forever to get there, and that might be.
You can easily have. Well, why you said? Why or how?
Why it took so long? What do you think? I'm just asking. What do you think was the reason why it took so long to get to Argentina in Spanish, and to Colombia? Is that right? Bogotá and Argentina.
Yes, the project Super Queer is a collective project that is based in Bogotá and Buenos Aires. Well, this is access to the book in paper, right? So access to the digital book, the first translation produced in the States, is available through the internet. I mean, you write the name of the anthology and you will easily find the book online freely. So the book was made accessible before that. The book is out of stock. Traficantes de Sueños used to sell it. It was part of their catalog. I checked this morning, and you wouldn't be able to get, the book that was published in the States today, because it was the only edition. The question, I think, is also why there was no a second edition of ISM, the book produced by ISM Press. One reason is that, and this happens with many, that might happen with many other books, scholars can read the English versions, and they are not made available, even if this book is a book that might interest people who do not work at universities. But they are not made available in Spanish easily. It's, sometimes scholars will, in Argentina, produce their own translation. And an example of that is Gabriel Matelo, my colleague. He has been translating all his life for his students to make text available for his course at the undergrad level or grad level, for that matter. So sometimes we get access to translations, or we try to read the original texts. But there is a tendency now, I think, and I tend to sense, because of the grad courses I had to teach, or I've been teaching this year, to produce the text in the language, in Spanish in our case. So there is some sort of interest, or because students can't read text in English or in French or Portuguese, which are the languages that I may include in the syllabus. But because there is this idea that knowledge should be translated to. And when you translate, as I have tried to show, there is an intervention, a situated intervention, a rereading of the material that is important to see how this makes sense in our syllabus. So, translation.
Laura, thank you for that very informative presentation. I was constantly taking notes because Saldua has always been very inspiring for me as well. And I also want to say two things. I recently learned that Gloria and Saldua also wrote children's books. I don't know if you knew that. So that could be, I didn't know that. That could be another interesting thing to see if those children's books have traveled. And recently, I started talking to a friend of mine who is Kurdish, and we thought about translating her books into, because they're bilingual, I think, at least one of them, and we thought it would be fascinating to translate, a book that's in English and Spanish into Turkish Kurdish and kind of explore that hegemonic relationship, right? But also a friendship across borders and this and that. So I wonder if her children's books have traveled. And the second one is, you mentioned Anna-Louise Keating, and she's been publishing quite a lot using, Anne Saldua's theories. And she just proposed this wonderful theory of post-oppositionality. Like, she's building on what Anne Saldua kind of proposed about this idea of interconnectivity, that we are all deeply connected to all life forms, right? So, and I'm just curious if Anna-Louise's works will eventually start traveling into Spanish. And I mean, this is not a question, but it would be fascinating to see this kind of continuation of this kind of growing of Anne Saldua's heritage on a transnational level. Yes. Yeah. But thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you, Emek. About the first thing, Gloria Saldua, as much as many other Latinx writers, wrote what we call tentacle children's literature. Sandra Cisneros, Julia Álvarez, Rosario Ferrer, well, many others, right? There are no available translations that I know of, but I have not researched into that. And I think the project of translating them into Turkish would be fascinating, Emek. So I want to know more about that. The second thing, translating academic work, scholarly work, it's quite difficult because it's really expensive, as you very well know. If you look at Anna-Louise Keating's books, perhaps what happens, and what I see in Latin America, is that sometimes, particularly Brazilian feminist translators and feminist translation scholars are really building networks of solidarity through translation. So if you publish, Olga Castro, one of Olga Castro's early papers on feminist translation was immediately published in Brazilian Portuguese. And the paper that the paper we wrote together, the introductory note, the MEC that we wrote with Luis Fonflotto and Olga Castro was immediately, practically simultaneously translated by Beatriz Guimarães from Brazil, and she did it pro bono, right? She did it because she believed in the project, and she has also, together with a colleague, Beatriz, has also translated a paper that we published in this special issue. So what I see is a lot of translation, interesting translation activity going on in Brazil at this time, but that is promoting and is fostering, furthering dialogues and solidarities, right? Because all the translations that I have mentioned are pro bono. I mean, they're not getting, unfortunately, they're not getting paid for that.
And also the global copyright regime is not making that kind of solidarity network easier. Like, I mean, Alicia, like when we discovered that your book was translated into Turkish already, I mean, clearly that happened outside that copyright regime. But that was decades ago. They got away with that, obviously. But can you get away with that right now? Like, how do we intervene in this kind of copyright regime so that it doesn't become an obstacle to transnational solidarities? That's an important question.
And I would say that it might not be that easy to get access to the Anzalduan Trust and get permission to, yes.
Yeah, true.
It's not so easy when the authors that you want to translate have passed. No?
Laura, one question. Sorry. This issue of communities of solidarity that has been all through the evening, through the afternoon, and the importance of giving and reaching a voice. How does that impact in your classes, when your classes as a professor of translation, literary translation? Do your students get involved into that? Do you find any special commitment with that? I'm thinking of how our students are usually involved in feminist movements and this idea of solidarity and sororities.
I thought you were reading a question from Natasha. This is your question.
I know, sorry, this is my question, sorry.
I was trying to follow and I couldn't find
I didn't want to interrupt, sorry.
I have to say that I must thank my students for showing me the importance of all these issues that I've been presenting today in my class. When, now it's about many years ago, but my students at university would start, when working on their translations, they will start asking questions about non-sexist language, inclusive language, and so on. And so this became a section in our syllabus. Feminist translation strategies, the problem of using non-sexist techniques in a language that is constantly making us produce these choices in our translations. So for me, even if I had been interested in the problem of gender translation within Latinx, the production of Latinx authors, the transformative experience in my case was a classroom, as bell hooks would have said, not because I was transforming them, but because I was transformed. So yes, definitely.
Good.
Yes, at grad and then at undergrad level, at graduate level as well. There is a question in the chat, I think, about what I meant by saying that strategies were interventionist, but not systematic. If I could read well, Cecilia.
Yes, let me read it. What does it mean that the interventions are not systematic? Does it have to do with the example you gave of the translator using the author's first name when talking about Gloria's personal life, and then the translator using her surname when talking about other topics?
No, not really. That was an example to show the translator's position before the different translated fragments, right? And how the translator would relate to Anzaldúa, perhaps as a friend or as a comadre, as she may have called her on certain occasions, and then how she would distance herself from what she is telling the reader by using the surname. So that's one thing which adds to the shaping of the discursive image that we might attribute to the voice of the translator within the translated text. What I mean when I say that strategies are not systematic, although this is an example of a non-systematic use of a procedure, right, of a translation procedure, is something different. In the use of generic forms in Spanish, in the translation, sometimes you notice that instead of saying los chicanos, imagine that the text in English says los chicanos, because sometimes they are addressed as such, they are referred to as in Spanish. Sometimes in the translation, we will find el pueblo chicano, right, which is a general form to avoid using a gender-marked noun. But in other sections in the same translation, we will find the use of masculine forms to generalize. So it's hard to say, or the use of graphical conventions. Sometimes italics are absurd, but on some other, or interlingualism. Sometimes we get the English and the English text or a fragment in English followed by a fragment in Spanish, but this is not a systematic, they don't produce a systematic discourse relating to that. But I would say that it's quite hard, and in a way, in the introductions they are saying, we trust readers will not judge us. We did our best, and sometimes it was not possible. It was not easy to produce systematic discourse in that way. So this is what I asked.
I'm going to read the next question from the audience. It says, I know you mentioned that Anzaldúa did not manage to develop these concepts so thoroughly, but could you talk about the notion of interconnectivity a bit more? Could we link it with the idea of communities of solidarity that Alicia so interestingly talked about earlier? Question for me. Maybe Alicia could also refer to this. Thank you to both of us. So I'll let you start.
Actually, Emek might know more about this than I do. So the notion of interconnectivity is developed in an essay that I think Anzaldúa published within an anthology in 2002. And what she was, if I recall correctly, what she was trying to do was to further the notion, in a way, the notion of intersectionality, which is questioning a monolithic idea of identity. But this, to fully understand the concept of identity, it's necessary to put it next to other identities. So it is this idea of collective being that is being reinforced by Anzaldúa in this essay. I believe it can be connected to the idea of communities of solidarity, because if I understood correctly, in this idea of communities of solidarities, we would be reinforcing or fighting for the collective what can be acknowledged as general, as common to other people, while retaining the specificity of your character, of your identity, what makes you unique. And Emek, would you like to add what you were?
Yeah, I mentioned, for some reason, I thought everybody sees the chat board. So I said, Annalise Keating published a book a couple of years ago. It's called Transformation Now. And she explores this notion of interconnectivity in that book. It's basically, as you said, it kind of imagining a kind of politics that takes us beyond the oppositional structures of identity. Like we are always fighting against something, right? And Zaldua basically says that only takes us so far. I mean, it's precious to do that, but we have to imagine beyond that. And that kind of, she proposes this notion of spiritual activism where we just kind of do inward activism, like transforming ourselves while at the same time transforming our relations with others and the world. And so it's imagining that all humans and other living beings are interconnected to each other, including the planet. And how do we basically coexist, right? That exploring that notion. I mean, it's really brilliant. And she has explored this in many other like bits and pieces, let's say, like her theory of La Nepantlara, there's that, and the El Mundo Zurdo, like there are all these different kind of terminology that she used to explore this notion. Yeah, so Alicia, if you want to add more.
I don't think I can add much more, but thank you for showing me this connection. I had to confess that I only came to Anzaldua's texts pretty recently, the last decade of my studies, and my daughter was more familiar with her work than mine. So, but Cantu is, since you talked about Cantu's translation, she took me to the first prison to see immigrants in prison in El Paso, and many decades ago. And she's producing now an anthology of poetry by women, and I was invited to be part of this. So watch out for her next project. There is another question or comment here in the chat. Julieta Amoravieta, she says, thank you. She says she wants to say that she lives thinking about subjectivity in a recent translation project I had on human rights in Latin America, and that there were tons of food for thought there. So I think that is the last comment. There is people thanking us again for a lovely afternoon. Thank you for bearing with us for 4 hours here on Zoom. I just can't believe that I stayed so engaged all these 4 hours, and thank you for being there. I don't know if there are more comments. There are 10 more minutes.
No, I think we are okay. So thank you, Maria Laura. Thank you, Alicia Pornoy. Thank you, Emek. Ergun, thank you, Cecilia Chiacho, for this wonderful afternoon. As Dolores Aisega says, really wonderful. I mean, it flew. I mean, it's true, it was 4 hours, but yeah, they went great.
It's just amazing how these, different conversations just worked so well together. I mean, it's just, thank you. It's so my brain is on fire in a good way.
Right. Yeah, right. So thank you so much, and see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow. Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Wonderful. Thank you again. Bye.
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 Bye.